We know that the church is all about God and people, but a place to call home is important too. And the story of Trinity is most certainly a story of good, godly, committed people, but it's also a story about their journey to find that place that they could call home. It's not always been a front row seat on the cityscape like it is now. Instead, it's been a long and winding road through the back streets of Perth. So let's go back to the very beginning and discover our journey from then till now.
In the early 1900s, Scotland, including Perth, saw an influx of revival meetings and camps held by different holiness proponents and preachers. From America came evangelists like D.L. Moody, the Higher Life movement, the Independent Holiness movement, Oswald Chambers and the League of Prayer. But in 1909, Perth became the focus of attention for a London-based movement called the Holiness Mission. Outreach services were held at the Dreadnought Hall in Hospital Street, just behind the A.K. Bell Library, across from the church's current location. It was those meetings that would become the seedbed of a new church in this fair city.
Five men were influenced and impacted by the preaching at those meetings here in Hospital Street: James Jack, James Shaw, James Robertson, William Stewart and Tom MacDonald. And these men became the founding members of our church. Today, one of those men, Tom MacDonald, still has family in the church that he helped to start. From Tom to his daughter, Chrissy McNichol, who many still remember with fondness. Chrissy passed away in January 2020, aged 101.
Then from Chrissy, we moved down a generation to her daughter Eileen, originally McNichol but now Benbow, and then to her children and her grandchildren. 5
generations. What a legacy. And I wonder what Tom was thinking way back at the beginning when he and the others started something new. Would he have imagined his great-great-grandchildren starting their young lives in the church he founded with the 3 Jameses and William Stewart?
It was on the 2nd of May 1909 that these men, led by James Jack, inaugurated what was first called the Perth Holiness Mission. In those early years, they met for weekly services in the Good Templars Hall here in King Street. They began to gather a growing congregation. 3 years later, they affiliated themselves with the Pentecostal Church of Scotland, founded by Reverend George Sharp in Glasgow in 1906, which then united with the Pentecostal Church of the Nazarene in November 1915.
Now simply called the Church of the Nazarene, Trinity continues to be part of a worldwide network of over 30,000 Nazarene churches spread across 165 different countries.
In 1914, the year before uniting with the Nazarenes, the congregation moved into what was called the Tin Kirk in Alexandra Street. The building no longer exists, but it was the first place that they could call home. Congregational growth was slow but steady, and by 1915 the official membership was 40.
Well, James Jack had been their lay pastor since 1909. A Canadian Reverend William Smith became their first paid pastor in 1913. However, by 1916 the church had returned to a lay-led congregation following Reverend Smith's resignation. In a report to the District Assembly, Reverend George Sharp remarked on the significance of the lay people in Perth. Perth Church is the most unique of all our churches. Pastorless, yet they have pastors. Indeed, the first 2 decades of the church's history into the 1930s indicates that pastors came and went quite quickly in the church, and it was the commitment and consistency of the people that contributed to its steady growth. As we serve in this generation, we would do well to remember that priesthood of all believers mindset that they held and lived.
The Tin Kirk was home for just over 20 years until 1935, when they had to move out of the Tin Kirk, so then became homeless. They rented the Guildhall in High Street for 3 years until 1938, then the Craigie Hall in Priory Place for a year. In the same year, the church bought land in Leonard Street to build a new church, but the Second World War meant that no progress was made on the venture. Everything came to a standstill. Out of necessity, they returned to the Guildhall in 1939. At the end of the war, everything was different, and the church was persuaded to sell the land in Leonard Street back to the city authorities for the construction of the bus station.
These were frustrating years for the congregation. It certainly curtailed some of their activities and ministries, but they continued to look for other building options. Several times properties came on the market, but one disappointment seemed to follow another. There were regular communications to the town clerk about possible sites, even revisiting other options on Leonard Street. But in the end, the church found nothing and continued to rent the Guildhall for another 18 years until 1957.
Reverend Leslie Hands arrived as pastor in November 1952, and along with his board worked tirelessly to find that home for the congregation. A site was granted on Milne Street just behind the current church, and a new building for the church family was finally opened and dedicated on the 25th of May 1957. The church was packed, and their longest standing member, Hugh Clark, was given the honour of opening the door to their new home. It was a time to celebrate, at least for now.
The land for the church building on Milne Street was secured on a 20-year lease, which meant that by the 1970s the church was faced with a dilemma: extend the lease or find a site that they could buy and own themselves. In truth, they did both.
The immediate need was to retain their presence in Milne Street and continue the ministry God had called them to, but the determination to buy their own land and their own building spurred them on to look for a new solution. An extension was granted to the lease on Milne Street, while the board and pastor, Reverend John Crouch, pursued new options.
It was in 1982 that the church took ownership of Trinity Church of Scotland on York Place. That church had united with St Leonard's in the Fields, and so the Church of the Nazarene made an offer on their building. An imaginative plan to reconfigure the internal space was designed, and the building work took place while the congregation continued to meet in Milne Street. When the extended lease ended in 1983 and the building work was done, the final move to this church took place. The people had found their own home. And that's almost where our nomadic story ends. But not quite.
York Place has been our home now for almost 40 years, and of course we now bear the name Trinity Church of the Nazarene. But in this last decade, the church has seen significant growth, and it was clear that a bigger facility was required. The Waverley Hotel stood next to the church building in York Place, and although it had been a popular hotel for weddings and celebrations in the city, its closure and subsequent sale made way for a homeless hostel in Perth.
It remained a hostel until its closure in 2011, and the building fell into disrepair. A serious fire in 2015 led to the demolition of the Waverley and the clearing of the ground. And it's on this site, literally out of the ashes, that our new building rises.
Following a number of years of wrestling with ideas, possibilities and negotiations, the church members agreed to build a new annex to the existing building to provide an extensive asset and resource to the city as well as to the congregation.
On Easter Sunday 2019, with contractors in place, the church celebrated a breaking the ground ceremony as they stepped into another new path on their journey. It was the start of another long and winding road, but nonetheless, 3 years on, and emerging out of a global COVID pandemic, this new building is complete, and it stands as a testimony to God's goodness and faithfulness, and to His faithful people who have given and sacrificed to make it a reality. We pray it will not only bless the church, but the community and the city beyond. We know that the church is about God and about people, but we're also thankful for a place to call home, not just for us, but for all. Jesus said to His disciples, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." Well, our new home is both a place of welcome and hospitality, but also of sending and going. And whether we're gathered or sent, we're called to breathe out and live out those healing words of Jesus to those around us when he said, "Peace be with you."